Uncover the hidden kingdoms within your family name. When people look into their family history, they usually start with a city, a parish, or a census line. But sometimes the first real clue is much older than that. Sometimes it is sitting in the surname itself, carrying the memory of a clan, a region, or even the shadow of a kingdom that shaped your ancestors long before borders were drawn on modern maps. That is what makes rare Celtic surnames so fascinating. They do not always tell the whole story, and they certainly do not prove a throne sat in your family tree. But they can point toward a historical landscape where power, identity, and kinship were once tied together. In other words, a surname may not tell you exactly who ruled, but it can hint at which Celtic kingdom your ancestors belonged to, served, defended, or helped define. And that is the journey here. I'm going to walk you through 10 rare Celtic surnames, what they can suggest, and how they connect to old Gaelic and Brittonic worlds that still echo in family names today. Along the way, we'll separate legend from history, because that distinction matters. A surname can open the door, but context is what tells you what room you've entered. Before we get to the surnames themselves, it helps to understand what Celtic kingdom really means in this context. We are talking about historical realms in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Western Britain, where Celtic languages, kinship groups, and local rulers shaped daily life for centuries. In Ireland, names often connect to provincial kingdoms like Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, and Munster, or to smaller dynasties inside them. In Scotland, surnames can point toward Gaelic lordships and ancient regions linked to Dál Riata, Moray, Argyll, and the Western Isles. In Wales and Cornwall, old Brittonic roots survive in names that preserve language and place in a form that outlived the kingdoms themselves. Few surnames are as strongly tied to power as O'Neill. Derived from the Gaelic O'Ne, meaning descendant of Niall, this name is linked to one of the most famous dynasties in Irish history. The O'Neills were not just a family, they were a ruling force in Ulster for generations. If your ancestry includes O'Neill, the historical signal often points north, toward the Old Kingdom of Ulster, and the UAE Nail power structure that shaped much of early medieval Ireland. The name connects to high kings, provincial dominance, and a long struggle over territory and sovereignty. O'Brien comes from O'Brien, descendant of Brian, most famously Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland who rose from the Kingdom of Munster. That association alone gives the name immense historical weight. It carries the imprint of a dynasty that became synonymous with Southern Irish leadership. If this surname appears in your line, it can point toward Munster, especially the historic power base of Thomond and the wider territory influenced by the Dalkais. The O'Briens were not just local nobles, they were builders of regional legitimacy and royal memory. McCarthy, from Mac Carthae, means son of Carthag. The name is deeply associated with the south of Ireland, especially the Old Kingdom of Desmond in Munster. The MacCarthys were one of the great ruling families of the region, and their influence lasted for centuries. If you see this surname in a family line, it often points to the west and southwest of Munster, where Gaelic lordship remained strong long after many older power structures had changed. The McCarthys were tied to kingship, landholding, and resistance to outside pressure. Because the name is less globally famous than O'Brien or O'Neill, it can feel more rare in genealogical searches. But historically, it is just as rich. It can anchor a family to one of the most durable Gaelic kingdoms in Ireland. MacDonald, or Mac Domhnall, is one of the great names of the Scottish Gaelic world. It is most closely tied to the Lords of the Isles, whose territory stretched across the Hebrides, parts of western Scotland, and maritime routes that made the sea as important as the land. If your surname leads here, the kingdom you are circling is not a landlocked realm. It is the kingdom of the sea lanes, island fortresses, and Gaelic nobility who governed by ship as much as by sword. The MacDonalds became powerful in a world where islands connected cultures instead of isolating them. This is a surname that can suggest the ancient realm of Dál Riata, as well as the later political order of the Isles. In either case, it points toward a Celtic kingdom defined by movement, ancestry, and sovereignty over water. MacLeod, from MacLeod, is often tied to the Isle of Skye and the Western Isles of Scotland. Though the name is Gaelic in form, its deeper roots may reflect Norse influence, which is exactly what makes it so important in Celtic history. The Western Isles were never culturally simple. They were places where Gaelic and Norse traditions mixed into a powerful local identity. If your ancestors carried this surname, the historical suggestion is often the Western Island world, especially a territory shaped by clan authority and maritime control. The MacLeods were not kings in the classic continental sense, but they belonged to a social order in which local lordship carried royal significance. Mackenzie, from Mac coinage, is usually linked to the Highlands, especially Ross and the northern Scottish regions, where older Pictish and Gaelic traditions overlap. While this surname is not always attached to a single kingdom in the neat way some Irish names are, it still points to a historically distinct power zone. For many families, Mackenzie can suggest a connection to the old northern world of Scotland, where shifting alliances and kinship networks formed the backbone of authority. The surname became associated with a clan that rose to prominence in the medieval and early modern periods. But the landscape it belongs to is much older. If you carry this name, your ancestral story may lean toward a frontier between kingdoms where Gaelic expansion met older local identities. That makes Mackenzie especially interesting. It can hint not just at a kingdom, but at a transition between kingdoms. McMillan, or MacMillan, is often associated with Argyll and the western Scottish heartland. The name is linked to the Gaelic world of Dál Riata, the early kingdom that helped carry Irish Gaelic culture into Scotland. That alone makes it historically significant. If your family carries this surname, it may point to the old western coast, where ships crossed the narrow sea, and royal power depended on kinship networks spread across islands and shorelines. Dál Riata was not merely a kingdom. It was a bridge between Irish and Scottish Gaelic civilization. The Macmillans may not always be the first surname people name when they think of Celtic royalty, but that is exactly why they are valuable here. They preserve a quieter, older strand of the story. McNamara, from Mac Conmera, son of the Hound of the Sea, is a surname tied strongly to Thomond and the Kingdom of Munster in Ireland. It is a name associated with learned families, military service, and noble status within a Gaelic political order. If this surname appears in your lineage, it can point toward the old ruling structures surrounding the O'Briens and the regional power networks of Northwest Munster. The McNamaras were deeply connected to the aristocratic and cultural life of the kingdom, not just its battles. This is a good example of how surnames can reveal more than where. They can reveal what role. Some names point to rulers, others point to the support structures that made rulership possible. McNamara does both. McGowan, from Mac and Gabhan, means son of the smith. At first glance, it may seem less royal than the other names here, but in Celtic society, smiths were not ordinary workers. They were essential figures tied to craft, prestige, and sometimes sacred status. Depending on the branch, McGowan can appear in Irish or Scottish contexts, and its connection to kingdom history comes through service to local elites and the communities they sustained. A smith's family might be attached to a royal center, a warrior network, or a regional stronghold. So, what kingdom does it reveal? Not always one fixed kingdom, but often the practical world that supported one. A name like McGowan can suggest proximity to power, especially in a Gaelic setting where skilled craft and status could travel together. If you are comparing surnames across branches of a family tree, this is one of the clues worth slowing down for. Vaughan, from Phi Chan meaning the younger or junior, is a Welsh surname with strong roots in the Old Kingdom traditions of Wales. Though it is not always the first name people think of in Celtic genealogy, it carries a very old Welsh identity and can point toward the political world of Gwynedd, Powys, or other medieval Welsh lordships. In Wales, surnames often preserve social distinction, lineage, or descriptive origins that became fixed over time. Vaughan is one of those names that may seem modest on the surface, but it belongs to a culture where noble houses, bardic memory, and local sovereignty mattered deeply. If you carry this surname, your family may be tied to the Welsh kingdom tradition rather than the Irish or Scottish branches of Celtic history. That makes it especially important because it broadens the map beyond the Gaelic world and into the Brittonic one. This is where caution matters. A surname is a clue, not a crown. Not every O'Neill descendant ruled Ulster. Not every MacDonald descended from a Lord of the Isles. Migration, adoption, spelling changes, and social movement all complicate the picture. Still, surnames can tell you where to look next. They can suggest a language family, a region, or a historical hierarchy. They can also point to whether your ancestors were likely connected to a royal line, a noble household, a learned class, or a craft tradition tied to a kingdom center. If you want to go deeper, combine the surname with parish records, clan histories, land records, and DNA evidence. And if you are curious about the deeper ancestral layer behind the paper trail, there are services that can help you begin that search quickly. By the way, you can find out your ancestral DNA in 3 minutes at www.findyourbloodline.com. Use it as one more clue, not the final answer. If you are already cross-checking family lines, it can also help to compare spellings from different generations before you decide a name has shifted too far from its original kingdom. Sometimes, the oldest record is the one that makes everything else click. O'Neill and O'Brien point to major Irish dynasties. McCarthy and McNamara anchor Munster's aristocratic world. MacDonald, MacLeod, Mackenzie, and McMillan draw you into the Scottish Highlands and Islands, where kingdoms were maritime, clan-based, and constantly negotiated. Vaughan opens the Welsh side of the story, where old kingdoms survived in language and lineage even after political independence faded. McGowan reminds us that kingdoms were not only ruled by kings, but sustained by skilled families whose roles mattered to the entire system. If one of these surnames is in your ancestry, start by tracing the earliest documented location you can find. That matters more than modern family memory. A name can travel, but records can show when and where it traveled. If the answer is yes, the picture becomes sharper. You may not be able to say your ancestors literally ruled a kingdom, but you may be able to say they came from a family line shaped by one. That is still powerful. It gives your family history a border, a language, and a political past. And if you want to keep building that picture, you can also compare your surname with broader Celtic naming traditions. Sometimes the answer is not in the grand title of the kingdom, but in the social role the family played within it. By the way, if you are still exploring the genetic side of the story, you can visit www.findyourbloodline.com and use it as a starting point for the next layer of research. It is one more way to connect the name on paper with the ancestry behind it. A rare Celtic surname is not just a label inherited from the past. It is a compressed story. It can hold a province, a clan, a kingdom, a craft, or a memory of authority that survived long after the original political map disappeared. So, if your name is O'Neill, O'Brien, McCarthy, MacDonald, MacLeod, Mackenzie, McMillan, McNamara, McGowan, or Vaughan, you are not just looking at a family word. You are looking at a doorway into an older Celtic world, one where power was local, identity was communal, and kingdoms were remembered through the people who carried their names forward. That is why these surnames still matter. They do not merely tell you where your ancestors came from. They hint at the kingdom-shaped world that formed them, defended them, and in some cases, ruled through them. And once you see that, a surname stops being just a surname. It becomes history that still knows your name.